Hey guys, it's Sam, and this is my spoiler-free review of Legacy of Kings by Eleanor Herman. This is an arc that I received from BEA this year. One of my friends who has a blog, I will link her blog down below, Aisha, she stood in line for this one, but had an extra copy or didn't need this one or anything, so she ended up giving me her spare copy. So again, thank you so much. So I was able to read this before it was released. But this book has since been released and it came out on August 18th. The normal pretty cover is right here. So this is a young adult fantasy about Alexander the Great as a teenager and young adult. And it is a multiple POV fantasy. So if you are not into multiple perspectives in your fantasy, you're probably not going to enjoy this, as a lot of the elements that I really enjoyed did have to do with the multiple POVs. I personally like multiple POVs, but I know a lot of people don't. So keep that in mind if you are thinking about reading this. Firstly, let me talk about the world building. The world building in here was excellent, as Eleanor Herman is a historian who has studied everything about this time period, and I am absolutely fascinated by anything antiquity, ancient, anything. I am so fascinated. I don't know a ton about Alexander the Great, which is weird. Obviously I know his name and his influence, but for the most part I don't know anything about his story, and so she takes his story, his real accurate story, and adds these fantasy elements into them, and it is so fascinating. All the things that she includes, some people might think that the little things she includes are a little bit too much information or a little bit too dense, but she will include these little things just about the clothing, about the religions, about the architecture, about the food, and I find it fascinating. But if you aren't into those kinds of tidbits, especially about ancient culture, you might not enjoy that, because this book is fairly long and there are parts of it that are devoted to those kinds of world building elements that are historical facts. I personally really enjoyed it and found it to make the world very rich and very realistic, because it was based again in reality, and it didn't drag on. I didn't feel like she info dumped at all. There was these small little tidbits that would pop up when something was being explained, and I found it to be very realistic and very immersive, and I really enjoyed those elements. Next, let me talk about our characters, because we have a whole plethora of them. First, there is Alexander, who is the Prince of Macedonia. He is Alexander the Great and will eventually become Alexander the Great, but right now he is 16 years old and he's been away from his home for a while. He's been off like training and studying and stuff like that, and he's been called back for various reasons, and so he's kind of being reintroduced to court life and court politics and dynamics and everything. He also has his best friend Hephaestion with him, who is a friend that he's had his entire life, but we're not really sure of his upbringing at the beginning and what his story is exactly, but he is a typical character who's a little snarky, a little bit of an ass sometimes, and kind of mean at times, but I think his character development is going to be amazing in this series, and I cannot wait. He's one of my favorite characters so far. Then we have Katrina, and she is from a village, and one of her good friends, Jacob, is also a perspective that we get, but Jacob is being entered into this competition that takes place in the Macedonian capital, so he is going away, and she ends up following him because she has some kind of mission that she feels like she needs to undertake. But there's something also a little interesting about Katrina, in that she can kind of talk to animals and sense things. She has this kind of magical quality to her that no one else really knows about. So she's a very interesting character, and she's one of the many perspectives that we do get, and she's another character that I think is going to grow a ton throughout the series, and I cannot wait to experience that. Then we have Zofia, and she lives over in Persia, and she is actually supposed to be Alexander's fiance. They haven't met, they've had like an arranged marriage, and they're just finding out about this, and we kind of get her story, which is completely separate. She's in a completely different nation, and there's a lot of different things going on with her that are eventually going to tie into the rest of the story. Zofia is a little bit naive, she's a little bit rash, she's kind of your very typical princess character, but I think she's going to end up growing a lot throughout the series. One of the other perspectives we get is Olympias. She is the queen and Alexander's mother, and she's an interesting character because she kind of floats in and out of every single perspective, and she's around a lot as she is the queen, but she is kind of a sinister character. She reminds me of Cersei Lannister. She's very conniving, a little evil, but you kind of love her for it. And the last perspective we have is Sin. She is Alexander's half-sister, and she is another kind of conniving, interesting character. She is plotting something because her mother was killed when Sin was a young girl, and her mother always talked about this kind of magic, and this magic that would help you basically be invincible, immortal. So Sin is kind of looking for that, and she's dabbling in very dangerous areas in pursuit of this kind of magic. So, as you can probably tell, there are a ton of POVs in this story. There's a total of 7 different perspectives that we end up cycling through, and some perspectives we get more often than others, but typically speaking, all of them are kind of equal throughout the story. I enjoyed pretty much all of the perspectives that we got, so I didn't find myself particularly bored. The problem that I had is that since every single chapter changes to a different perspective, every chapter basically ends on a cliffhanger for the other perspective. So you have to wait a little bit to get back to what's going on there. So even though I would enjoy the next chapter as well, I'd be thinking, oh, I wish I knew what was going on in this chapter still, but I have to wait a little bit. So it wasn't that any of the other chapters were boring, it's just that every single one ended on some kind of like tension point, and you want to know what was going on with that, and then you get pulled into the next one. That would end on a tension point, and etc, etc. So if you aren't into those kinds of stories and switching POVs, I do not believe you will like this. I enjoyed it, and I was ultimately okay with it, but that is something that kind of irked me a little bit. Since there are so many characters, I really can't get in depth about any of them, but I will say that I really enjoy pretty much all of the characters. I find them all very interesting. They all have different motivations. They all are kind of morally gray in a way. Everyone has their different kinds of motivations and their different belief systems. It's very interesting how everyone is kind of interweaving. I'm also not going to talk about couples or relationships at this point, but if you are into relationships and relationship dynamics, there's definitely a lot of relationships to choose from within this series, and there's a potential that I've seen for 2 different hate to love ships with different people. It's not any kind of like love triangle or anything like that. I don't really think there's any kind of really love triangles going on within this story, but there's definitely a lot of potential for people pairing off later in the series, but there's definitely some hate to love potential in here. 2 separate couples. So if you're into that, just wanted to give you a heads up about this. So lastly, I do want to talk about the plot. As I already mentioned, the chapters do switch around a bit, so there is this kind of like stop and go a little bit within the plot, but ultimately it is moving forward, especially in the last half of the book. There is a lot of setup in this book. I will admit that. There's a ton of setup, and there needs to be for this kind of vast, sweeping story that Eleanor Herman is creating, and this historically rich, fascinating story. But there's a lot of setup. So if you are kind of hesitant about first books and stuff, and this is a fairly chunky book, I will warn you about that. For a while, you're not sure how everything is going to interweave and everything, but by the end of the book, you really want to know what's going to happen. I'm really anticipating the second book already. This is going to be an epic series and an epic story. This is a story that we've heard about historically for generations, obviously, and so the fact that we're getting this historical element, but also this fantasy added element in there, it's just going to be fascinating, and I'm really looking forward to the rest of the series. This book set everything up so wonderfully, and I cannot wait for the next book in the series. I end up giving Legacy of Kings 4 out of 5 stars. I'm also going to be doing a spoilery gush video on this book, so if you're interested in talking about all the different elements and all the different threads going on, go ahead and check that one out. I will link it down below. Comment down below, let me know if you have read Legacy of Kings and what you thought of it. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see all of you guys soon. Bye!